So we look at science. Science teaches us who do we think we are, and dissociates from how we feel, the emotional sense of us. I remember, who was it? One of the great atheists was talking about nailing the last nail into the coffin of vitalism. I forget whoever it was that did that. And it's, to me, that's very interesting that as an organism, we are vital. That's why we're alive. Sure. And yet, from the kind of scientific position, many people are looking at, oh, well, we're just DNA being carried around by these bodies, or we're just synaptic functions that are carried down into the body, and we're basically brains that are being carried around. What an interesting way of looking at the human experience. And it's not that it's untrue, but it's, I don't know, it seems a bit pitiful.
I think one of the attractions about science for me, as opposed to ideology or religion as alternative ways of establishing belief systems, is that, and you get a range and a diversity in science, but you can also find a lot of humility where people saying, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Like if you take the area of consciousness, mm-hmm. you'll have a lot of neuroscientists saying, we don't know mm-hmm. how consciousness emerges from the brain. Some people say we may never know mm-hmm. how that emerges. There are 86 billion different neurons in a human brain and up to 100 trillion different networking connections amongst those neurons, that we don't even know how many different cells are in a human brain. Mm-hmm. In other words, the level of ignorance that we have about how the brain functions to draw our attention to something, to be aware of it, and then form a consciousness as part of that computation system. It's where we have some ideas, but we really, from a scientific point of view, don't know, right. and don't have answers or pretend to have answers. So the thing about science is the humility is not pretending to have answers that run in advance of the data that you can make sense of.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, having a worldview, a materialistic, reductionistic worldview, that pretends that it does know. Yeah. I mean, the fantasy, because it is a fantasy at this point, that consciousness is somehow created in the brain, in these brain synapses, we don't know that.
We don't.
And yet, it's like there's underlying assumptions in everything that I can assume. It's like if I make a statement, there's an assumption there's a worldview underneath that assumption.
Right.
And that's where any position can potentially fall down.
Yeah. But at least in science, if you take a hypothesis, if it's a scientific hypothesis, it means it can be falsified.
Sure.
And that's the difference. Religion has a lot of assumptions and hypotheses, but none of them can ever be falsified.
Well, if we're talking about socialized religion, that's absolutely true. We have 41,000 different Christian groups because of the social evolution of one individual.
Yeah.
And every time there's a generation in any group system, it changes.
Sure.
And it becomes more spread out and more diluted so.
But it's still very effective, because if you think about the role of, say, Christianity in the West, particularly in the United States, it still plays a fundamentally important role.
Sure.
Even though it's split amongst 41,000 different denominations.
Right.
It's just hard to think. 41,000 different kinds of Boy Scouts.
Mm.
Or
well, there's one Bible and there's 10 Commandments, so there are probably consistencies in the 41,000.
Yeah.
And there are probably
there's going to be a lot of overlap.
Yeah, yeah. And that's that's how the religion has translated itself into a social phenomenon, which, at least in my reading, isn't where religion started. It started with an individual's experience of unity in one way or another. The kingdom of God is within, God is love. There's all of that existential Christian belief, which, at least in my reading, as I say, came from experience.
But it's interesting, in other modern areas, when you see the fact, we've scaled from when our population bottlenecked about 10,000 breeding couples 60,000 years ago to over 7 billion people now, that things have scaled in huge ways. I mean, corporations now scaled way beyond what nation states would have been 400 or 500 years ago. Mm-hmm. The value of Apple Corporation in the United States, I read, is now larger than the entire worth of the Russian stock market.
Sure. And that's evolving. Apple, Facebook.
And you see that scaling that's going up. In other words, things are becoming larger, unified structures where religion is splittered into all of these tens of thousands of little groups, which seems to be a way of a belief system that is disconnected with trade, commerce, technology, consumerism.
Well, it's a moral system at this point, and it's gotten away from that basic unification experience. I mean, when the Buddha was asked, "What's different from me than you?" he said, "I'm awake." And I find that one of the most interesting ideas and maybe experiences it's possible, because his assumption is that you and I and everybody else are asleep. And what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean about the human organism? What does that mean about consciousness? What does that mean about potential?
And what does it mean about waking up?
Exactly.
When you waking up to what reality is then perceived at the time that you wake up.
Right, and that's where we go back to the basic experiences of the religious teachers, the unification experience, that there's all is one is one of them, and it's that whole sense that there's a unification that the species and maybe the whole universe shares, that's just kind of sitting, waiting around for us to wake up. And all the traditions, every major religion and most of the minor ones have a mystical aspect to them. Whether it's the offshoot, the Sufi offshoot of the Muslims, or the Christian mystics, or the Buddhist meditators, whatever it may be. So there's this unification experience that seems to be potential. Whether it's synapses firing in a certain way or whatever, we don't know that. But we do know that there are different levels of human experience. There's levels of less connection or more connection, individually, collectively, and maybe universally. The people that have had those universal experiences say that, hey, there's a special reality that is so incredible and amazing and alive and so much more real than me as an individual entity that there's no comparison. And of course, the psychiatrist will say, "Oh, dissociation," or whatever the technical term is, but they pathologize it rather than seeing that as perhaps where the evolution of civilization is moving, hopefully. I mean, it's either moving into more fragmentation or more unity.
I mean, there's a counterpart of that science as well, where there's always been an attempt from the time of Einstein, if not before, to have a kind of a unification, a grand overall theory that will explain everything from the time of the Big Bang. And so it's not just religion that's after that holy grail, but science as well.
Oh, absolutely. And what I find interesting is that the scientists are essentially on that level talking about what the Buddha was talking about 2,600 years ago, that there is, it's not, I mean, the intellect, the scientific intellect, which is an egotistical formulation, it's a person who is dissociated from the wholeness, is looking for a picture of the wholeness. And the mystic is saying, yeah, well, you can do that, that's far out, that's wonderful, sure. And you can also live it. You can immerse yourself in the totality of the life experience. And as an artist, I mean, that's where the artist is trying to go. Sure. And I'm sure, as a writer, yes. you know that there are those moments of connectedness into whatever that creativity thing is that remains unnamed. And when that happens, that's when it, at least as a musician, that's when it all makes sense, and that's when thousands of hours of practice and
sure.
that culminate into a unity.